Welcome back to The Mindful Hunter. I'm your host as always, Jay Nichol. And if you want to find out which of the 9 tents I tested had the highest score and how you can enter a raffle to win one of these tents, stay tuned. Okay, for starters, let's go over the list of tents that I tested. There was the Big Agnes Copper Spur, To Summit Telos TR2, Hilleberg Niak, MSR Hubba Hubba, Nemo Dragonfly, Glacier Skyscraper 2P, the Kuiu Mountain Star, the Hilleberg Helags, and the Slingfin Portal 2. Now, a couple of these tents were loaners. Specifically, the Helags was loaned to me by Hilleberg. The Glacier was lent to me by my buddy Leighton. I'm going to put his Instagram right here. Go give him a follow because we would not have been able to test the Glacier without his help. And my other buddy Bob lent me the Slingfin Portal. I'm going to put his Instagram right here. Go give him a follow too. Big respect to both those guys. They've got a lot of big hunts coming up and they were good enough to lend me their tents. Deeply appreciated. Now, other than that, I previously already owned the Hilleberg Niak. All the rest of the tents I paid for cash. The Big Agnes Copper Spur, the To Summit Telos TR2, MSR Hubba Hubba, Nemo Dragonfly, and the Kuiu Mountain Star. So there was no direct input from any manufacturer and no one has any editorial control over the output or the resulting film that I'm choosing to make. Remember, the whole point of the Mindful Review series is unbiased, analytical, unsponsored, pure reviews because I'm sick and tired of the bullshit in the industry, and this is my attempt to kind of combat that. Next up, obviously, I needed to find some way to recoup the funds that I keep sinking into these reviews because it's just not economically viable for me to keep buying all this material for all these reviews. So I came up with the idea to do a raffle, threw a poll up on Instagram. It seemed to be met with really powerful interest. So here's what we're gonna do. There are 4 tents left after I returned the ones that I borrowed that are gonna be entered into the raffle. So the Big Agnes Copper Spur, the Hilleberg Niak, the Nemo Dragonfly, and the Kuiu Mountain Star. Now, if you total up what I paid for those tents, including taxes and shipping and everything, comes out to $3,398. We're gonna add $602 to that as a donation to the Wild Sheep Society of British Columbia. And that brings us out to an even $4,000. So I'm gonna sell 100 tickets at $40 per ticket. And that will give you a 1 in 25 chance of winning one of these tents. Now, the tent you win will be randomly selected and the winners will be randomly selected. All this will be done on Instagram Live, so you can't choose which tent you enter the raffle for. It was just too much of a nightmare, and I knew some tents would be oversubscribed and other tents would be undersubscribed, and the whole point is to figure out a way to crowdsource the funding for these super in-depth reviews that I like to do and you guys seem to like watching. This is a bit of a pilot project. If this works, the list of things that we can review is essentially endless because I know I can keep covering my costs. So please participate in this and show your interest, and that will let me know that you want me to do more stuff like this. Now, you can buy no more than 3 tickets, so 120 bucks, but you can buy up to 3 tickets if you want. So here's the deal. You're gonna go to my website, mindfulhunter.com. You're gonna go to the shop page, so mindfulhunter.com/shop. And there's gonna be an item there for purchase. It's gonna be a tent raffle ticket. You will be able to add up to 3 of those into your cart. When you buy that and you process the payment, that will give me all the information I know. As soon as the raffle is sold out, I will pick a live winner well, 4 live winners, and I'll give away the tents. I am leaving Friday for a sheep hunt. So I'm gonna do everything within my power to get this raffle done and closed before I leave for sheep so that I can get these tents shipped out before I leave for sheep. If we're not fully subscribed though, it's just gonna have to wait until I get back. So also, people who subscribe to my newsletter were given advance notice of the raffle. So it's possible that if you're watching this video, the raffle might already be sold out. So if I were you, I would go before watching the rest of this video, because all these tents are decent. I'm telling you that right now. Some are a little bit better than others in different categories, but these were all premium tents. And even if you don't get the exact tent you want, you're still gonna get a $700-800 tent for 40 bucks. You can sell it used and use that money to go buy the tent you do want. It's a great deal for everybody, and it helps fund this project. And if you want to know about other raffles with advance notice, join my newsletter. Go to the tools page on my website and enter your email. You'll be given a free PDF download of a meal guide I bought, and then you will be on my newsletter subscription list for future raffles. Also, go down into the comments section at the end of the video and let me know what you want to see next. What other categories? Is it rain gear? Is it pants? Is it boots? Is it electronics of some sort? Let me know the categories, not the specific products, but the categories you want to see these large-scale comparative reviews done in. I like to make a little note about the psychology of consumer purchases before I start these things. I did the same thing in the last video and went over really well, and hopefully there's new people watching this video. And so if you've heard this before, you can tune out for the next 2 minutes. If you haven't heard this before, people like to belong to tribes. And these days, the tribes we belong to are the brands that we support. So your analytical decisions are clouded by an emotional attachment that you may have towards one brand. So I just ask that you take everything I say here with a grain of salt. I don't mean to insult a brand you love, and I might have some critical feedback for one of the brands that you really like. Be open to it and recognize that none of these brands are perfect and all of them have room for improvement. And when we're making buying decisions, we tell ourselves that we make them objectively, but really you make them emotionally and then you rationalize them cognitively. In our brains, we feel like it's done in the opposite. And in fact, they've done studies where they track people's buying decisions. And when I ask you to remember why you bought it, you will give me the technical objective reasons, but in reality, when you monitor people real time, it's actually an emotional connection that forces us to make the decision, and then we rationalize it cognitively with objective technical reasons after the fact. This is where confirmation bias comes in. So we tend to prefer incoming information that agrees with opinions we already have. And we tend to shy away from information that disagrees with opinions we already have. And we do that because it creates a sense of cognitive dissonance, and that's uncomfortable and we don't like it. So do your best to actively engage and seek out information that conflicts with some of the opinions and beliefs you already have. It's only going to create a more well-rounded opinion. Also, everything that I'm about to share is just personal opinion. It's just my own experience. There's nothing to say I'm totally right, you're totally wrong. You could have had a completely different experience with one of these tents, and that's your experience to have, and I'm not going to argue with you about it. And lots of times I get feedback that actually enriches these reviews after the fact, where people will say, well, that's not what happened to me, and then give me a story where they had some conflicting results. I think that's great. So just recognize I'm doing the best I can, but I'm just one person and I have a limited amount of experience. These are also more like lab tests than field reviews. I haven't had the opportunity to run all these tents in the field extensively. Obviously, I set them all up. I did a bunch of testing with them, but I could always do more. And if I wish I had a year to do this and I could take each of these on a 10-day hunt and provide a much more thorough and rich feedback and review process. But I did the best I could with the time I had in order to create like a replicable, comparable set of categories that I could test again and again and get similar results. There's no such thing as a perfect tent. Each of these tents excels in a different way, and each set of circumstances we find ourselves in as a hunter will have an ideal tent for that situation. One of the most frustrating things I go through is people get in touch and they want to know what's the perfect X that I should go and buy. There is no perfect X. Given the circumstances of each hunt, there will be one particular product that will be best for that hunt, but you will have to make compromises on how it performs for you in other hunts where it is under different circumstances. So I'm going to do my best to go through all the categories, share the ranking and the score that they got across all the categories, share the overall winners and the second place and third place based on points. But then I'm going to also highlight what I think the 3 or 4 best tents are in a variety of other categories, like the lightest, the best one for big guys, the strongest, the cheapest, or the best value one. So just recognize expecting one tent to do everything for you in all circumstances is unreasonable. And the longer you're in this game, the more gear you're going to build up in your gear locker, and you'll have the right tool for the right job for a number of different jobs. Over the course of the test, I looked at 30 different categories. These were practical height, practical length, practical space, spec height, spec length, spec space. Now the difference between practical and spec, practical was me in the tent, feeling it out with my body. Spec is what it said on the spec sheet on the website. The 2 sleeping pad test, price, weight with the scale, weight honesty. Weight with the scale was me literally weighing it when it showed up with everything that was in the bag that you were supposed to take to the field, took off all the tags, did all that. Weight honesty was the discrepancy between what it weighed when it showed up and what the website said it should weigh. Tent pegs, ease of setup, stitching quality, build quality, pole quality, rain test, wind test, footprints, practical vestibule space, breathability / no condensation, warmth / inverse of condensation, zippers, practical floor durability, practical fly durability, spec floor waterproof rating, spec fly, spec canopy, freestanding, doors, and ease of getting in and out. Now there were 30 total categories. I only ended up assigning scores in 20 of these. And that was because throughout the course of doing different tests and looking at different elements, I recognized that some of these were inappropriate to score individually, and I'll go over each one of those I'll go over why that was the case as we get to each one of those particular categories. Now, one of the pieces of feedback that I got from the pack review was that you wanted more B-roll and you wanted more actual footage of the packs. So with the tents, I did a much better job of taking the camera gear with me out into the field and getting a variety of footage of the tents in the field. So as you watch this review, I'm gonna sprinkle in a ton of footage and voiceover from when I was out in the field actually conducting the tests. All right, let's dive into the actual results. So up first, we're gonna look at the practical space considerations. So what happened here is I actually climbed in each of the tents, measured the distance I had in height and length, and then compared them across all of the tents. I'm going to insert this footage now, and then I will go over the comparative ranking that I gave each of the tents. All right, so I'm about to do the practical sizing tests where I'm going to get into each one of these. And just for the record, I'm 6'1", currently 230 pounds, and it's insanely hot out today. I picked a terrible day to do this. So this is going to be somewhat expedited. I need to get in, lay down, make some general comments, and then GTFO. So I appreciate your patience if I seem a little bit rushed. All right, this is the Big Agnes Copper Spur. Got pretty decent headroom, maybe 3 fingers. If I sit like up as tall as I can, I still got maybe 2-3 inches. And if I lay down, so yeah, my head is basically touching and my feet are touching at the same time. So it's not the longest tent in the world. Some other general comments on the interior. It's half fabric, half mesh. So I think it's gonna give you a nice blend of breathability, but also staying warm for those later season hunts. It's got this really cool internal storage pocket over here, a second door and a vestibule on the far side, and pretty average vestibule space in here. You could slam a full pack in there if you had to. Up next, we have the To Summit Telos. The headroom is okay. If I sit up as straight as I can, my head is just brushing the top. But if I just sit normally, I've got a good 3 fingers. Now, if I stretch out, I've got a good, 3-finger gap here. And then my feet aren't touching at all down there. Now, this is one of the reasons I do these practical tests, because this tent actually doesn't measure as one of the longer tents, but because of the perfectly vertical sidewalls, it's got more practical length than some of the other measured as longer tents go. Some notes about this one. Primarily a mesh canopy, so it's going to be great for condensation and breathability, but not quite as warm. A couple little internal storage pockets, which is nice. And the fly goes all the way down to the ground, which is nice because when you have so much mesh, I worry about underspray from rain. This is a very unique tent in pole structure and shape and everything. I think it just very recently came on the market. So I'm particularly intrigued by this one because it's rare you see people do anything really notably different in tent design over the last few years. And I feel like To Summit did something really interesting here. All right, up next we have the Hilleberg Niak. This is my tent that I've owned for the last season. I took it sheep hunting last year. I really like this tent for a variety of reasons. It's very simple to set up. It's very durable. It's a true 3-season tent, borderline 4-season tent. There's another 2 tents in this lineup that I think are, for most people's purposes, you could consider 4-person tents, and that's the Stone Glacier and the Helags. So decent headroom. That's why I got this one, a good 2 to 3 inches, even when I'm sitting straight up. Now, I will say, when I'm laying down, it's essentially the same as the Hubba Hubba. My feet and my head do just barely touch at the same time. And this is important to note because even though it's a double-walled tent, because this is fabric and not mesh, you are 100% going to get condensation, which is not the end of the world, but you need to recognize that your sleeping bag, the toes of your sleeping bag, are going to be brushing up against a wall with condensation on it. So if you have a down bag, you might want to slide a dry bag over the end of your sleeping bag, or you might want to consider a synthetic bag. But this one actually has quite nice width. Now, they call it a 2-person tent on Hilleberg's website, but they do make a disclaimer that it's more like a 1.5, and it's not as spacious as the other tents in their 2-person lineup. Okay, up next, we've got the MSR Hubba Hubba. Again, if I sit very tall, I'm just brushing the top. However, when I lay down, very spacious lengthwise, not touching, basically identical to the To Summit. Nice organizer pocket here at the end. This one is also heavily fabric, but it does have these mesh vents up at the top. So I think it would be a decent hybrid. Definitely could take this into the later season as it's going to stay warmer, but you are going to get condensation in here, but probably not as much as the Niak because there's more venting in here. So we're in the Nemo Dragonfly, shortest tent so far. My head immediately, I'm slouched right now. If I sit right up, like I'm crushing the roof. This is also tied for first place for the lightest tent, so it's not surprising that it's smaller. Now, for headroom, I have maybe a ½ an inch up top and another ½ an inch down below. So, not the longest tent in the world. Nice storage up here. Again, heavily meshed, maybe half fabric, half mesh. Here's what concerns me about this tent. Can you see this airspace here? So the fly comes down almost to the exact same line as the fabric comes up. So when it rains, if this lifts up at all, or if it sucks back and lays on this, you're gonna get water coming right in here. And that concerns me big time. Now there is a guy line there and you could tie it out, but I don't know why they would make it so close. Like, why not just put on an extra 2 inches of fabric there, either raise the internal fabric or take the fly down an extra 2 inches, and you'd just be buying yourself more security for a very negligible weight penalty. So that's a note of caution for me. All right, we're in the Skyscraper 2P, just palatial. This is the tallest tent by a country mile. Let's see how it does for length. Yeah, it's okay, but not great. Head is just brushing and toes are just brushing. So very tall, not so long. Now this is kind of interesting. Very cool ventilation, or even, I mean, it wouldn't be a stove jack inside the tent, but cool ventilation option there. Like I noted earlier, I think this is essentially a 4-season tent. It's got 10 mil poles. The entire internal canopy is fabric. There's very little mesh, none to speak of really at all. So it's a bit of a standout in this group of tents for me. But if you only had enough money for one tent and you wanted it to last 3 and 4 seasons, you could get away with this. But I think it's gonna be hot in the summer, and I think it's gonna condensate in here to a degree. Okay, we're in the Kuiu. This is gonna tie with the Nemo Dragonfly for height. I wouldn't opt for either of these. Sitting up is very important to me, but I've talked to a lot of dudes who don't give a shit about sitting up inside a tent. They're more concerned about the weight of the tent or structural stability. So just because it's something that I don't personally like doesn't mean that it's a deal breaker for everyone. Let's see what it's like laying down. Yeah, this is decent. And again, it's because of the vertical sidewalls. I've got a good couple fingers here and down at the bottom. Lots of foot room, like a good 2-3 inches before I touch it. Now, this one definitely falls into that true 3-season. It's got a significant amount of mesh inside, almost all mesh. But again, that fly goes all the way to the ground. Interesting, like little rope to hang stuff to dry in here. You can open this up. That's kind of cool. Second door, second vestibule. Again, with the vestibule space, pretty decent. You could squeeze a pack in there if you had to. All right, when the Hilleberg Helags, my head touches the top, but it's kind of this light internal fabric. It doesn't seem to bother me quite as much in here because it's not tight, but it does touch. Now, as far as head and foot room, I mean, it's wild in here. Like, if I go right in the middle, I've got, 6 inches up there, maybe an entire foot down there. This is the biggest tent by far, and what I would consider really the only true 2-person tent of the bunch. All right, now we're in the Slingfin Portal. Really nice headroom, good 3-4 inches up there. Lots of room to move around.
Definitely a little lacking on the headspace. Again, I'm 6'1", but I'm touching pretty solidly here and definitely touching down at the bottom. Now, one thing to note is the tents with mesh canopies, I'm not quite as concerned about touching because they're not going to gather the same amount of condensation that the fabric canopies are going to gather. Got some interesting storage components in here, some wires to hang stuff, but yeah, pretty roomy other than the length.
Okay, so that gives you an idea about how a 6'1", 230-pound man fits in each of these tents. Now, how did that relate to a comparable score? So for height, the Stone Glacier got a 5 for being the tallest. This was followed up by the Big Agnes Copper Spur and the Slingfin Portal 2 with 4s. The To Summit, Hilleberg, MSR all got 3s. And then the Nemo Dragonfly, the Kuiu Mountain Star, and the Hilleberg Helags all got 1. And this was solely decided on how much headroom I had. For length, the Hilleberg Helags came in the number 1 spot. The Hubba Hubba and the To Summit each got a 4. The Dragonfly and the Kuiu Mountain Star got a 3. Up next, we have practical length, or the head and foot room when you're laying down. Coming in at first place was the Hilleberg Helags. And then with 4 points was the To Summit and the MSR Hubba Hubba. 3 points for the Nemo Dragonfly, the Kuiu Mountain Star. And 2 points for the Stone Glacier and the Hilleberg Niak. And then only 1 point for the Slingfin Portal 2. So the overall practical space scores, the Hilleberg Helag came in at first place with a 4, and the To Summit tied that with a 4. The Hilleberg Helags had significantly more legroom, but the To Summit's additional headroom kind of balanced that out, so they got tied for first place. And then the Big Agnes, Hilleberg Niak, MSR, and Stone Glacier and Slingfin all had a 3, and then the Kuiu Mountain Star and the Nemo Dragonfly had 2 apiece. So for a dude my size, the Kuiu Mountain Star and the Nemo Dragonfly are really the only 2 I wouldn't run personally, based on space alone, right? Now, I did not give a ranking for the spec height, the spec length, or the spec space, because this is just what the company says the lengths are. Now here's something that's very interesting. On paper, the To Summit Telos and the Kuiu Mountain Star say that they are both 84.5 inches long. And yet, when I get into the Kuiu Mountain Star, I'm touching head and foot. And when I get into the To Summit Telos, I have significant room head and foot. So I'm not sure exactly how these companies come up with these measurements, but I think because of the inconsistencies in fabric drape and just the real world circumstances of how stitching and fabric and poles and all these like dynamic elements fit together, this was what originally had me doing tent reviews, is that I would order a tent that said it would have X amount of room, and then it would get here and it wouldn't be anywhere close to that. So the only way, in my opinion, to really understand how big a tent is to get inside of it and see how you fit. A prime example of this is I once ordered 2 tents. One tent said it had 41 inches of headroom. The second tent said it had 39 inches of headroom. These are from the same manufacturer. When I got into the tent with 41 inches of headroom, my head was hitting the top. And when I got in the tent with 39 inches of headroom, I had 2 inches clearance. So really, the only way to tell this stuff is to test it out for yourself, or a guy like me who's obsessed enough to test it all and record it and upload it for you all to see. Now, the next test I did was called the 2-pad test. Here's the deal. These are all marketed as 2-person tents. So if you didn't know anything about camping, you would think that you would be able to take 2 adults into any of these tents and go camping. That is not the fact of the matter. And to be honest with you, there is only one true 2-person tent in this whole bunch, and that's the Hilleberg Helags. That is the only one where you could take 2 grown men and actually go out camping into the field. The rest of these, your sleeping pads would literally be laying on top of each other. I'm gonna insert that footage of the sleeping pads right here.
So here you can see 2 sleeping pads in the Big Agnes. And obviously there's no possible way to fit 2 people, as the pads are literally right on top of each other. You could maybe squeeze in 2 tapered pads going the opposite directions. Again, here's 2 sleeping pads in the To Summit. Same level of overlap, maybe 2 tapered pads, highly unlikely for 2 grown men. The Hilleberg Niak with 2 pads, again, similar overlap, possibly 2 tapered pads, but certainly not 2 full-grown men on 2 rectangular pads. Here's the MSR Hubba Hubba, and this is the first tent. I mean, they are right up against each other, but technically you got 2 full-size pads in there. Here's the Nemo Dragonfly, and almost just a little tiny bit of overlap. It's tight. Could definitely do 2 tapered pads in this one. Here's the Stone Glacier Skyscraper 2P, and just like the Dragonfly, it's just barely overlapping. So you could definitely do 2 tapered pads in this one. Here's the Kuiu. Again, heavy overlap in here. Definitely not fitting 2 tapered pads. Here's the Hilleberg Helags 2, and arguably the only true 2-person tent in the lot. You got 2 big pads in there with room to spare. You could use 2 large rectangular for sure. Okay, here's the Slingfin Portal, and again, heavy duty overlap. Maybe 2 smaller tapered pads, definitely not 2 large tapered pads.
So you can see that except for the Hilleberg Helags, none of these tents technically qualify as a 2-person tent. Now, I will say the Hubba Hubba was extremely close, and if you put 2 tapered pads in there, you could get away with it. And the Nemo Dragonfly and the Stone Glacier Skyscraper were just, you know, another inch or 2 and you could get away with it. So I'm sure if you had to, you could squeeze 2 dudes in there as well. But that's not the point. You shouldn't have to squeeze 2 people into a 2-person tent. If it says it's good for 2 people, it should be good enough for 2 grown adults. And the fact of the matter is, it's just not the case. These are all basically luxuriously big tents for 1 person. Okay, now let's take a look at price. There was a really big discrepancy in price. In Canadian funds, the cheapest tent on this list is the Hubba Hubba at $650, and then at almost twice that amount is the Hilleberg Helags at $1,370. Now I have included shipping and taxes in that because I'm in Canada, but even if you're in the States, I think it's important to understand the cost to your door. Which, you know, different companies charge differently for shipping. Different companies are in different states and there's different tax laws. So I just, as if I ordered everything to my door from the manufacturer or from a distributor, what would it actually cost? And so when we assign a score to that, they basically all fell into 4 different categories. So the cheapest tents were the Big Agnes Copper Spur, the To Summit, the Hubba Hubba, the Nemo Dragonfly, and the Slingfin Portal 2. All these tents were between $650 and $750. Up next, we have the Stone Glacier and the Kuiu Mountain Star. These tents were around $900. And then the Hilleberg Niak was about $1,000. And the Helags, as I already said, was $1,350. Next, let's move on to the weight with scale. So the lightest tent of the bunch, I'll actually just tell you all the weights. So the final weights, as they showed up at my door, The Big Agnes Copper Spur was The Big Agnes Copper Spur was 3.05 pounds. To Summit 3.6. Hilleberg Niak 4. The Hubba Hubba and the Dragonfly were 3.15. Skyscraper was 5. Kuiu Mountain Star was 3.7. And the Hilleberg Helags 5.15. And the Slingfin Portal 2 3.15. Now, as far as weight honesty goes, so the Big Agnes Copper Spur showed up at 3% less than the advertised weight. The To Summit also showed up at 3% less than the advertised weight. So this is a good thing. This means that the tent is just like 0.1 pounds lighter than the advertised weight. The Hilleberg Niak was 6% overweight. So it said it was 3.75 pounds, but the actual weight of the tent was 4 pounds. The Hubba Hubba was 3% under. The Nemo Dragonfly was bang on. Said it was 3.13, weighed 3.13. Stone Glacier was slightly over, 2.2 pounds over for a 4% discrepancy. And the most egregious tent was the Kuiu Mountain Star at 7%. It was supposed to weigh 3.45 pounds. It actually weighed 3.7 pounds. Now, the Hilleberg Helags was underweight. Advertised was 5.3, actual weight was 5.15, and the Slingfin Portal was also underweight, advertised 3.3, actual weight when it showed up 3.15. So what does that mean for the scoring? So the lightest tent was the Big Agnes Copper Spur, followed by the Hubba Hubba, the Dragonfly, the Slingfin Portal 2, followed by the To Summit and the Kuiu Mountain Star, followed by the Niak, and then the Hilleberg Helags. Sorry, that was then followed by the Stone Glacier, and then that was then followed by the Hilleberg Helags. I will also upload this spreadsheet, so if you want to dig in deeper to any of the numbers, you'll have that opportunity. Moving on to tent pegs. Now, this was an interesting thing to score because what exactly are you looking for? Are you looking for durability? Are you looking for surface area? Are you looking for lightweight? So what I tried to do was assess the best combination of all three. So let's just take a moment and talk about that. Durability. The tent pegs needed to be beefy, and I hammered these things into the ground because where I set them up, the ground was very firm, but it was also not rocky, so I knew I could give them a good beating, and none of the tent pegs bent, not a single one. So durability was important, but surface area is also important because if you're camping in a variety of circumstances, from snow to sand to loose soil, really thin pegs with small amounts of surface area slide out of the ground much easier. And then finally, weight. It's all good if a tent peg is durable and has a lot of surface area, but if it weighs 1/4 pound, that's kind of ridiculous as well. So basically, looking at those three categories, I just simply ranked them out of 5. So the best tent pegs were the Big Agnes, Hilleberg, Nemo, Stone Glacier, Kuiu, Hilleberg, and Slingfin. And then the ones, you know, that weren't quite as good, they're still fine, but I mean just a little bit less good than that whole group. The Hubba Hubba, very small surface area. They're like little wee rectangular pegs, and I would have concern. Snow for sure, and loose soils and sand, definitely a potential issue. And then the To Summit pegs were incredibly lightweight. And I don't know, maybe they're made of titanium and they're crazy strong, but my gut feeling on these is that I do have some concerns over long-term durability. And if you got used to whacking these things in, and I know you're not supposed to use a hammer, but in the real world, you have to smash these things into the ground from time to time. And I just have some long-term concerns because they were so lightweight. But overall, very high quality tent pegs across the board. Up next, we're gonna move to ease of setup. Now there's one thing to note. Once you've set up a tent a couple of times, they're really all easy to set up. So I was trying to look for things that stood out that would make the tent more complicated over time, or particularly challenging on the first time to a user that had never set up that style of tent. So the easiest tent to set up is the Hilleberg Niak. And one of the interesting things about Hilleberg's color coding is that yes, yellow stands for 3 season, but yellow tents are also simpler to set up. Most tents in the yellow lineup will have symmetrical poles. So the Niak only has 2 poles. They can only go in the 2 slots that are there, and they're symmetrical poles. So the Niak, you cannot screw up. There's also only 4 guy lines on the Niak, so it's particularly quick and easy to set up. Now, that was followed by the Big Agnes, To Summit, Nemo Dragonfly, Kuiu Mountain Star, and the Slingfin Portal 2, all incredibly easy to set up. After that, we have the Hilleberg Helags, the Stone Glacier, and the MSR Hubba Hubba. Now, here were the things that stuck out about that. With the MSR Hubba Hubba, in order to get the attachments to line up correctly, you kind of have to simultaneously thread the end of the poles through 2 eyelets at once. And I just noticed this was a bit of a pain in the ass. And if they'd made one piece of fabric a little bit longer, you could have put the fly on after the other attachment. Also, if you're in incredibly windy situations and you had to peg the tent down before you put the fly on, you'd have to remove each peg in order to lift that pole up and slide the eyelet under. Whereas if they just moved to a buckle system like most of the other tents, this wouldn't be a concern. So that bugged me a little bit. The Stone Glacier has an ungodly number of guy lines. As a general observation, the Stone Glacier's somewhat of an overbuilt tent for a 3-season tent. And in my opinion, it's actually a 4-season tent. And I'll get into more of that later. Now, you can reduce the complexity by doubling up the guy lines. And essentially, there's a high guy line and a low guy line. And if you extend the length of the high guy line and minimize the length of the low guy line, you can kind of pair them up and use one peg for both, and then use the line locks to put the appropriate amount of tension. This halves the number of pegs that you need to put in the ground, and it makes the setup process go a little bit quicker. But it's just when you're comparing all these tents at once, like 8 other tents only felt the need to use, 2, sometimes 4 guy lines, and the Stone Glacier felt the need to use 8. It seemed a little bit excessive. Also, the kind of internal pole wrap system is a little overcomplicated for a 3-season tent when you compare it across the range of 3-season tents. However, take all that with a grain of salt, because if you're looking for a hybrid tent that you could use in 3 and 4, I would argue that the Stone Glacier is probably your best bet. And then finally, the Hilleberg Helags is the only tent that's not freestanding, and it's a tunnel tent. And tunnel tents have to be put up in a very particular way. It's not something that you're going to do intuitively. You have to read the recommendations, because there's 2 pegs that you have to put in first. Then you have to slide all 3 poles in. Then you have to put in these other 2 pegs, and that kind of pops everything up. Then you can put in the rest of your pegs in your guy line. And if you try doing this out of order, the tent's not going to get set up right. So it's not necessarily a weakness of the tent, because tunnel tents by nature are also the greatest volume per surface area. So you have more room inside of a tunnel tent per weight measurement than any other design of tent. But what it means is it's A, not freestanding, and B, it's a little more complicated to set up. So there's just 3 there that were a little finicky, but none of that would stop me from buying any of these tents. It's just something to note. Overall build quality, everything got a 5 out of 5 except 2 tents got a 4 out of 5. Now, the reason I gave the Hubba Hubba a 4 out of 5 is it's the only tent that uses a carbon fiber pole system. And as soon as I opened up the tent, one of the carbon fiber poles was splintered. I personally don't like carbon fiber poles. Carbon fiber, when manufactured in the way that you would make an arrow or a tent pole, is really strong when force is applied to it in one direction. But when you apply force to it counter to that direction or perpendicular to that direction, it's not very strong at all. And like, that's why you can snap a carbon arrow in half. And that's why most archers who like give a shit will buy like footers or point components or whatever you want to call it to shore up the tip of that arrow, where if you hit on an angle, it's going to have an undue amount of force perpendicular to the actual plane of strength of that particular piece of carbon fiber. And so making tent poles out of this kind of blows my mind. Like, I don't understand why you would do that, because you're going against the very nature of the strength of the carbon itself. So quick note, that tent is not part of the raffle. And the reason for that is I returned that tent. They were going to warranty replace the poles. I'm sure there's lots of happy Hubba Hubba owners. They were great to deal with. Valhalla Pure, where I bought the tent, was more than happy to exchange the poles. And there was a lot of good things about that tent, and that might be something you're willing to live with. But for me personally, it just exposed a weakness in the design of the tent, and I didn't want that to be one of the ones I raffled. So I told them, listen, this has only been set up once. I never took it camping, and they were willing to let me just return it. So I just didn't include it in the raffle. And personally, I wouldn't buy the Hubba Hubba because of the carbon fiber poles. This is another benefit of doing a comparative review like this. When you have 9 tents and 8 of them use poles created by DAC that are either the NFL or the NSL series, and then 1 tent decides to use carbon fiber poles created by Easton, you gotta ask yourself, does one company know something the other 8 don't? Or do 8 companies realize, listen, DAC aluminum poles are the best poles on the market. Let's just use what everybody else is using because they're the industry standard. There have been other carbon fiber poles pulled off the market because of splintering and shattering issues as well. Like, this is a bit of a known issue. Now, the other build quality issue for me was the Nemo Dragonfly. And this was very minor, but I'm trying to look at a composite of different things. So I'm almost looking for minor differences. The seams of the fly don't match up particularly well with the actual poles underneath it. Like, there's a bit of a stretch factor, when you're looking across the board, all the other 9 were like bang on, or all the other 8 of the 9 were bang on. But the Nemo itself, it just didn't match very well. And it just made me question the kind of QC or the quality control of the build process. And it would be nice to almost see 2 or 3 dragonflies and, are there differences between each of the flies? And I'll get into it later, but there was one point on the dragonfly that didn't line up particularly well. And I think it creates the potential for negative, harsh weather circumstances. And I'll dig into that when we get to that category. Up next was pole quality. And I can kind of save some breath here because I just said all of the poles, except for one, are made by a company called DAC. Now, they have an NFL series, which is a Featherlight, and an NSL series. If you've ever seen a pole that has a predetermined shape and it's a DAC pole, that's actually a really piece of complicated technology that allows them to introduce pre-shaped bends into the poles, which can allow you to have like more extreme contours, and it doesn't weaken the strength of the overall pole structure. That's the NSL line. Perfectly straight poles tend to belong to the NFL line, but these are kind of analogous as far as quality and price and all the rest of it. So it's kind of a meaningless difference. Now, so they all got a 1 for pole quality. The only one that didn't, obviously, was the Hubba Hubba because it splintered, and I'm not a fan of carbon fiber poles. And I would like to make a note about the poles that Stone Glacier have chosen to use. So the DAC poles range in diameter. Obviously, the greater the diameter, the stronger the pole, but the heavier the pole. So all of the other tent poles range in diameter from 8.5 millimeters to 9.3. And sometimes there'll actually be like an 8.7 and a 9.2, or an 8.5 and a 9, like 2 different diameter tent poles on each on one tent. The Stone Glacier tent poles are 10.65 millimeters, a full 1.35 millimeters greater than the next largest diameter tent pole. You don't see 10 millimeter poles plus in 3-season tents. It's not until you start getting concerned with heavy duty snow load in 4-season tents that you start to see these 10 millimeter DAC poles pop up in a variety of designs. And this is another reason why I say the Stone Glacier Skyscraper really to me is a 4-season tent. It's built like a 4-season tent. It's a full fabric interior. It has a condensation vent. It has 10 millimeter poles. It has 8 guy lines. I don't know what else you would do to this tent to make it a 4-season after everything that's been done to it, which is why it ended up losing a couple points across the board, because when you're comparing, you know, for size and for weight and for ease of setup with all these 3-season tents, and then you've kind of gone and overbuilt this tent, it might not score as well. But I don't want it to be taken as a negative, because it is comparable in general space. It is roughly comparable in cost, and you're getting this much beefier tent. Now we're gonna get to breathability versus condensation in a bit. So there is a compromise that you're gonna have to take into account there. But I just wanted to note that with the poles, they're very beefy poles when you compare them with the rest of the poles that the other 8 tents have chosen to use. Okay, the rain test. Here's where I'm a little disappointed. So I had lined up a Volkswagen powered propeller that shot wind at 90 miles per hour that literally required a technician to bring it to the property and operate it while it was on the property. And I was gonna blow the shit out of these tents, spray water on them, test a bunch of things under wind. And the day before the review, the guy calls me and he goes, "Can you give me your insurance information for the review?" And I was like, I don't have insurance. A buddy is just lending me a paddock in his farm for the day, like for a couple days. And he goes, "Oh, I can't," because this guy actually uses these things on movie sets and they always have insurance. And he's like, "I can't bring this unless I'm insured. If something happens, I'm gonna go bankrupt." So with a day to respond, I'm like, now what am I supposed to do? Because that was kind of the crux of this whole thing, was this cool wind machine. I went to a tool rental place. I got the best drum fans I could find. I was able to generate wind up to 27 or 28 kilometers per hour. But I'm gonna be honest, it was not as forceful as I'd hoped, and I would like to find a better way to test this moving into the future. So I did get some results, but not the results I want. Here's some footage of the way I had it set up and some of the reactions from some of the tents.
All right, so up next, we're gonna have the wind/rain test. I rented 2 gigantic drum fans. I'm able to get about a 25 kilometer per hour wind directly on the tent. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna spray each tent for 2 minutes with the wind directly on the tent. And then I'm gonna open up the tent and I'm gonna look inside and see if any of it sprayed through. I'm gonna move it all around. I'm gonna do my best to see how these hold up. Now, this is not a perfect test, and you know, you could rip this test apart if you wanted, but you know, in these semi-lab conditions, like something that I can replicate and do identical to each tent, this was the best idea I could come up with for now. As the Mindful Review project evolves and grows and becomes more sophisticated, hopefully I can get more equipment and kind of level this up. But for now, I thought it would be a great way to potentially expose some of the weaknesses of some of these models. So let's go. All right, we have ourselves a result. Here's the Nemo. And those are water droplets that clearly made it inside because of this gap here. Now, you will notice there's a guy line attachment there. And I know someone in the comments is going to say, why didn't you put a guy line attachment there? Here's the deal. Nemo sends you enough pegs to do the 4 corners and the 2 vestibules. They give you guy lines for a variety of other attachments, but they don't give you pegs. And I'm testing these the way they showed up. Now, if you took an extra peg and ran a guy line out there, there was very minimal droplets in there. I think you could solve that. But I still say A, bit of a design flaw, and B, Nemo, bad on you. You should have supplied more pegs.
So you can see that every single tent was able to stand that relatively mild wind and the 2 minutes worth of water that I sprayed on all of them. There was never any water inside any of the tents except that Nemo Dragonfly. And as I noticed, or noted in the, space videos, it was that the fly being a little bit too high over the mesh component that is a bit of a weakness of a design, and I just don't know why they don't keep that down another 6 inches. And here's another thing, there's a guy line hole there, but Nemo doesn't give you enough pegs to run guy lines. So if you didn't open those up and count before you left for a hunt, you're not gonna be able to guy line out and create the distance required to not let water come up and in under there if you have a strong wind coming from that side of the tent. But as long as you take some extra tent pegs with you and guy line out that side, I don't think it's gonna be a big issue. It's just something I wanted to bring attention to because it's not the best design, and 6 inches more fabric would have solved that. Wind test, again, I did not assign a score here because I was not able to generate enough wind to produce a noticeable difference between any of the tents. They all took it like champs and, you know, were built equally strong. Footprints, when I first ordered some of the tents, it looked like some of them came with footprints and some of them didn't. It turns out only one of them did, the Stone Glacier, so I just didn't assign any scores for these. And I'll get into the floor fabric later on, but I don't believe personally you need a footprint with any of these tents. None of them are that thin that you require a footprint. And the interesting thing to note here, by the time you drop down in fabric strength enough to create an appreciable difference in weight in the tent, you then also lose the durability and you have to bring a footprint, canceling out that weight benefit. For example, Nemo has a tent that's lighter than the Dragonfly, but it has a weaker tent that requires a footprint. And by the time you bring a footprint, you're almost up to the weight of the Dragonfly in the first place. So why not just get the Dragonfly? And that was one of the factors that I used when selecting which tents went into this review. I wanted not crazy light tents, I wanted ultralight tents because I needed them to be beefy enough that they would actually withstand, you know, the rigors of a good hunt. And so having a decent floor fabric is part of that. Up next is practical vestibule space. Here's a quick video showcasing the different vestibules of all the tents.
Okay, here's the Slingfin vestibule. You could definitely get a pack in there if you had to. And it's got a matching vestibule on the back. Here's the Helags vestibule. This is the biggest vestibule of all of the tents. Here's the Kuiu vestibule, very decent size. Stone Glacier vestibule, Nemo Dragonfly vestibule, MSR Hubba Hubba vestibule, Niak vestibule, To Summit vestibule, Big Agnes vestibule.
So again, I kind of broke these out into categories. Now the one tent that had clearly the best vestibules was the Hilleberg Helags. 2 vestibules on either end, tons of room. You could have had a pack in there. You could do a little cooking in there. You could do all kinds of stuff. You could even shut it from the rain and still do stuff in there. Like really nice, practically utilitarian vestibules. Followed by the Stone Glacier on its own in second place. And then in third place, the Big Agnes, the To Summit, the MSR, the Nemo, the Kuiu, and the Slingfin all had pretty decent vestibules, like practical. And then in last place was the Niak. And the reason the Niak is in last place is that all these other tents have 2 doors. So not only do you have the vestibule space for the door that you're using on a regular basis, you can also open up the second door and have a second vestibule to keep stuff dry, but outside of the main tent compartment. Whereas the Niak only has the 1 vestibule. So it literally has half the vestibule space of any of these other tents. I want to talk about the next 2 categories in concert because I almost didn't score these because they somewhat cancel each other out. And that's breathability to warmth, or the ability to decrease condensation, or the likelihood that you're going to increase condensation. So for the main tent canopy, and let's get some nomenclature figured out here. We have the floor, we have the canopy, which is the main body of the tent, and then we have the fly, or the outer tent. Now, all the tents had a differing amount of nylon or mesh on the canopy itself. Some tents were 100% mesh, some tents were 100% nylon, and some tents were a combination thereof. Now, the more mesh you have on the canopy, the better breathability you're gonna have, the less condensation you're gonna have, but you're also gonna have a reduced warmth rating of that tent because the air is freer to move out. So it's kind of like the warmer you make a tent, the more condensation you're gonna get. And the cooler you make a tent, the less condensation you're gonna get. Now, some tents have utilized some really innovative venting technology, like the To Summit has a whole venting window up top with like an elevated part by the fly that's super cool. The Stone Glacier almost has what looks like a stove jack inside. There's like a whole sleeve that you can open up to help air it out. Regardless though, the general rule of thumb, more fabric on the canopy, more condensation, more mesh, more breathability. So when we go through and rank these, the most breathable tents were the To Summit, the Nemo Dragonfly, the Kuiu Mountain Star, and the Slingfin Portal 2. And the warmest tents were the Hilleberg Niak, the Stone Glacier, and the Hilleberg Helags. You're basically full mesh tents, best breathability, full fabric tents, warmest. Zippers. I wasn't able to discern a difference in quality of zippers. I thought maybe I would be catching fabric and stuff on more or less, or I would feel that some were flimsy and you know, ill manufactured. I couldn't discern a difference, so I did not score the zippers category. Also, practical floor durability and practical fly durability. I also originally thought when I made this video that I would be able to visually tell the difference between the quality of some of the fabrics, and you can't. Not on these 9 tents. They're all of such high caliber and the fabrics are all of such high quality. There are subtle differences between the fabrics. Some are a little bit stretchier, some feel a little bit thicker, but that's not to say that any of them are better than the other. So again, I went with the specs on this department and I didn't rank the kind of practical texture or feeling or intuitive ranking of the individual fabrics. Okay, now let's get into the spec ranking of the floor, the canopy, and the fly. First, I'm gonna go through and tell you what each of the actual fabrics for the tents are. So the floor for the Big Agnes Copper Spur. Before we get into the floor fabrics, I wanna talk a little bit about a hydrostatic ranking. So when you see a rain jacket that has like a 30,000 mm or a 40,000 mm, what that means is that they've taken a 1-inch diameter tube and they've held it onto the fabric. And then they've filled that tube with water and they have measured the height that tube needs to get filled to with water before water starts to seep through the fabric. So for example, if you had a 100 mm hydrostatic rating, that would mean that they were able to fill this tube 10 centimeters tall before the fabric started to leak. So the bigger the number, the more water, the greater the pressure that that fabric is able to endure before the waterproof elements are penetrated and you start to leak. You gotta take this with a bit of grain of salt with tent fabric because lots of them will have silicone or rubberized, they'll be impregnated or coated. So you might be looking at the hydrostatic rating of the fabric itself, but some of them have added an additional coating that could make it more water resistant or actually totally waterproof. So what we've done is I've compared the qualities of the fabric itself and their known hydrostatic ratings because there's really no way to assess the quality of the silicone impregnation of the rubberized coatings other than saying that the manufacturer says it's waterproof, but there's no way that you can really test that, or there's no comparable list of rankings for those materials that are available. So going through each of them, now the Big Agnes uses a proprietary material. All these other tents use a denier rated ripstop nylon. So a 20D, a 15D, a 10D. So you know that a 20D is stronger than a 10D, for example. So I don't know what D rating the Big Agnes floor is. I'm going to assume it's 20-ish because that's what the rest of the floors are and they felt that way. But it has a 1200 millimeter hydrostatic rating. The To Summit is a 20D ripstop nylon with a 2500 millimeter rating. The Hillebergs are a 70D. Now, when I said you couldn't tell the difference between the fabrics, that's all well and good until you get to the floors. The floors of the Hilleberg are a tank. Like, they are way thicker than any of the rest of the tents. So 70D, 15,000 millimeter hydrostatic rating. The Hubba Hubba 20D 1200 millimeter, Nemo 20D 1200 millimeter, Stone Glacier 20D 1800 millimeter, the Kuiu 20D 1200 millimeter, the Helags is the same as the Niak 70D 15,000 millimeter, and then the Slingfin is 20D 1800 millimeter. I don't think I've mentioned it so far in this review, but it's well known. Stone Glacier advertises this themselves. Slingfin designs and manufactures Stone Glacier tents. So you'll notice they're the only two on there that are 20D with an 1800 millimeter rating, and that's because it's the same company and they're using the same fabric. Now, so what does that give us for an actual score? So coming in at first place is the Hillebergs, obviously with the 70D nylon. Coming in at second place is the To Summit, because even though the rest are all 20D, it's got the next highest waterproof rating at 2500 mm. Third place is the Stone Glacier and the Slingfin at 1800. And then fourth place are the rest of the tents at 1200. The Kuiu, the Nemo, the Hubba Hubba, and the Copper Spur all have a 1200 millimeter waterproof rating with a 20D ripstop nylon. Now, let's move on to canopy. So again, these are going to be a combination of fabric and mesh and a level of durability of ripstop nylon. So we basically go between 10D and 15D. So the Big Agnes, again, we don't know what it is. It's a combination of fabric and mesh, and it could be any number of materials that are somewhat analogous to some type of nylon, but we don't know which one. To Summit is a 15D. The Hilleberg Niak is a 10D. MSR Hubba Hubba, 20D. Dragonfly, 15D. Stone Glacier, 15D. Kuiu, 15D. The Hilleberg is a 10D, and the Slingfin is a 15D. Now, when I rated these, I gave a higher ranking for more fabric because that had greater durability than the mesh. So if there was two tents that were both 15D, but one had more fabric, then I would score it slightly higher. So for ranking on the canopies, coming in at first place is the MSR Hubba Hubba because it was the only tent that had a 20D fabric. And then all the rest of the tents I actually scored equally because they were a combination of either 15D mesh or 10D fabric. Now, moving on to the fly, Big Agnes, we've already been over this, some type of nylon, we don't know what. The To Summit is a 15D, Hilleberg Niak is 20D, MSR Hubba Hubba 20D, Nemo 15, Stone Glacier 15, Kuiu 15, Hilleberg Helags 20, and then the Slingfin Portal 2 is a 10D. But there's this, it's kind of like a sill nylon, and it's been impregnated, and it actually has a 1200 millimeter ranking. So I think it's a 10D, but I'm gonna say it's a beefed up 10D. And I do think it's comparable with the rest, even though on paper it looks like it's not quite as good. So again, with the fly, I gave first place to the Hubba Hubba, the Niak, and the Helags. Second place to the Kuiu, Stone Glacier, and Nemo, To Summit, and Big Agnes. And last place, just getting 1 point less, is the Slingfin because they went with the 10D material. Now the next category is freestanding, because I do prefer freestanding tents. I think they have several benefits. I don't think it's the end of the world, and I don't think it's like should be a major deciding factor, but I do think it gives them a bit of an edge. All the tents were freestanding except for the Helags. So all the tents got 1 point in that category, and the Helags got no point in that category. Doors, I think having a second door is a slight benefit, and there was only one tent in the review that didn't have two doors, and it was the Niak, so it got no points in that category, and every other tent got 1 point. And then the final category that I was gonna look at was the ease of getting in and out. I thought there might be a perceptible difference in the ease of getting in and out. And under these ideal conditions, like a nice dry day, there was really no notable difference. The only thing I will call out is that some tents are really hard to get out of in the rain. Like I notice with my Niak, no matter what I do, if it's covered in condensation or if it's raining outside, when I go to flick back that door, it dumps rain down inside the tent every time, and there's nothing I can do about it. But until I have the opportunity to run into these tents in the rain, I don't really have the ability to make those observations across the board. So I just left that category unscored. So now I'm gonna go through and tell you the winners. Obviously, we're gonna do the winners based on points, but then I'm also gonna define a set of different categories that I think some tents shine in particularly well. So we are gonna have best value, best actual two-man, the lightest, and the strongest. So first of all, let's get to the points. This was scored out of 100 points because there was 20 categories and the highest score possible was a 5. So 20 times 5 is 100. So a perfect score would have been 100. Now the number one scoring tent got 55 points and the last scoring tent got 47 points. Now that's only a difference of 8 points, which is only an 8% difference. So I don't want you to think that just because a tent got last place, it's a bad tent. That's not the case at all. It's just that based on the way I scored the categories, it had the lowest overall score. So I would use these like overall rankings as a data point, but if there's something in particular that you need from a tent and one of these tents, you know, knocked that particular aspect out of the park, buy that tent because it held up. All the tents held up across all the categories. Very small differences that kind of added up over the course of the whole thing. So in first place, we have the To Summit Telos TR2, and that is actually the tent I'm going to be taking on my sheep hunt. I did not have any indication which tent I was going to take on my sheep hunt. I told myself I would take the first place tent, whatever that turned out to be, so that I could test it further and provide you guys more feedback. So the To Summit Telos TR2 got first place. In second place, there was a tie between the Big Agnes Copper Spur, the Hilleberg Helags, and the MSR Hubba Hubba. However, I'm going to DQ the Hubba Hubba. because of those carbon fiber poles. If you want carbon fiber poles, far be it for me to tell you to not buy this tent. But if you don't have an inclination one way or another, my advice to you is to not buy a tent with carbon fiber poles. The risk-reward complex is asymmetrical. You're introducing more risk for less reward. So we're gonna DQ the MSR Hubba Hubba. And then in third place, and this is kind of hilarious, we have a tie between the Stone Glacier Skyscraper and the Slingfin Portal. Now what's funny is that there are not two tents further apart the spectrum on each other. The Stone Glacier is built like a tank, and the Slingfin is like the definition of a super agile, ultimate, ultralight tent. And the fact that they got an equal score across 20 different categories, but were oppositely scored on almost every category, and are made by the same manufacturer, I gotta give some credit to Slingfin. Like, these dudes know how to build a tent, all the way from super mega ultra lightweight to super mega, battle tank. I'm not gonna get into the rest because the differences were so minimal that it doesn't really matter. Now, the best value, if price is what matters to you the most, the Big Agnes Copper Spur is your best bet. It's a very affordable tent. It tied for second place. It's the way to go. Now, the best actual two-man tent is the Hilleberg Helags. If you're going hunting with a buddy and you're gonna share one tent, it is the only one of these tents that in good conscience I could tell you to take, unless you're both 5'3" and 165 pounds and use, extremely small pads, then maybe you could take one of these other tents. Now, if you're bringing your kid or your wife, it's a different story. But this is a hunting tent review meant for two dudes who are going hunting together. So the bottom line is, if you're gonna go hunting with another dude, you're both grown men, the Hilleberg Helags is the one you wanna pick. The lightest tent was the Big Agnes Copper Spur. I gotta say the strongest tent, and it's almost a three-way tie between the Stone Glacier Skyscraper, the Hilleberg Niak, and the Hilleberg Helags. I think because of the additional guy lines on the Skyscraper, I'm gonna give the Skyscraper just a bit of an edge and say it's the strongest. But if we're gonna go for durability and long lasting, it's gonna be the two Hillebergs. Here's the thing about the Hillebergs. They might not be the biggest tents in the world, they might not be the cheapest tents in the world, and they might not be the lightest tents in the world, but you're never gonna regret buying a Hilleberg, and it's gonna last you through thick and thin. Now, if you're a more advanced hunter and you're willing to assume a little more risk, I do think there are more interesting options on here for you, which is why, for instance, I'm gonna take the To Summit. It's not quite as strong as my Niak, it's not quite as durable, but I'm gonna save half a pound and I'm gonna have more headroom and more vestibule room than I would in my Niak. So this is the way I want you to think about it when you approach tents. Like, what characteristics are important to you and which tent best combines those characteristics. There's no shit tents on here. There are just tents that do better in certain categories than other categories. All right, there you go. That's all I got. Please engage with the platform in any way you can. Like, comment, share, subscribe. If you haven't already, please go hit up the raffle, because if there's enough people interested and you're gonna help support this, I will literally start polling for the next review tomorrow. And whatever it is you guys wanna see me do this level of in-depth analysis on, we will literally pick the next category and I'll start buying products tomorrow if we can sell this raffle out in good time. If you have any feedback, if there was things you thought I did that were shit, if there were things you thought that I did were really good, I'd love to hear about it. You can email me, jay@mindfulhunter.com. You can shoot me a DM on Instagram, mindful_hunter. And please drop some comments below the YouTube video. And specifically, let me know what category of gear you want to see reviewed next. Is it rain gear? Is it lightweight pants? Is it bows? Is it some type of electronics. Can't thank you guys enough for the support. And until next time, thanks for tuning in.